Hey, my name is Elsie, and today we're going to talk about how to upgrade your technical writing. So, we all know that every writer wants to be able to tell better stories, but sometimes in certain mediums we aren't the only ones telling our story. Whether it's in a writer's room or when it's a dialogue between a writer and an actual player of a video game, for example. So this is going to kind of be a deeper look into how we as writers are able to level up our craft and or adapt to new ways of telling our stories. And we're going to take game design and look at Agile framework, which is a framework for basically getting things done, and then how that applies to iterative writing, which is the main focus of our actual topic today, and sort of how we're adapting the Agile framework to our needs as writers. And then we're going to be looking at feedback, which is a big part of getting that iterative writing cycle through, so that we can combat our own biases, and then actually refining our work, how we actually tangibly improve. And I'm going to include some examples. So, what is Agile and why do I actually care? So, it sounds like a lot of buzzwords, but basically, iterative writing is partially based on Agile development, which is this framework that focuses on dividing work into phases, emphasizing continuous delivery and improvement. It's this philosophy that argues that by enabling adaptive planning, rapid execution, and ongoing evaluation, we achieve more responsive and successful outcomes. So iterative writing, therefore, is sort of this process of writing, testing, and refining a narrative or a specific piece of dialogue multiple times in order to improve a piece's quality, coherence, and emotional impact. And it's not quite editing because the process of forming the story itself, it's sort of like a pre-production thing, whereas editing, you're kind of doing things after the fact. And so this sort of enables you to not feel like you're trapped into certain ideas when you do finally get into the editing phase. So what does iterative writing actually improve, though? We're going to be looking into how it improves refinement, consistency, and engagement. And so first we're going to talk about refinement. And it's sort of the idea of creating multiple iterations, being able to allow you to identify weak points in your story and in your characters and in your player choices, especially if you're working on a game. So we're going to be able to ask those questions like, why does it matter that this character does this action here? Can this element be cut? Is that line of dialogue really necessary? Is it moving the story forward? And then other things like that. And then consistency is the second thing that it helps us with. It helps us maintain consistency across branching dialogues and storylines, ensuring that our narrative doesn't feel disjointed, which can happen pretty easily in a video game, especially when people are working on multiple different parts at once. So by doing multiple assessments of work and using some techniques I'll cover shortly, we can ask ourselves, do our characters have a distinct voice? Do my themes align across the entire narrative? Does the plot progress logically even in a non-linear narrative? Those are important questions to tackle. And then we have engagement, and this is either player or reader engagement. And iterative writing allows you to refine how players engage with the game's narrative, making their choices feel more authentic and impactful. So especially when you're playtesting or having people read or edit your work, iterative writing puts you in a sort of headspace that is more open to outside input because it forces you to confront your biases concerning what aspects of your writing are actually serving your goals versus detracting from them. Iterative writing also gives you more space to play around with nonlinear narratives and creates opportunities for players to forge their own living narrative, or sort of carve out their own personal legends from the food for thought that you provide as a narrative designer. So how do you actually do it? First of all, you start simple and you build complexity over time. Then you focus on key moments and goals. Step 3 involves playtesting early and often, and I have playtesting in quotation marks because this could also apply to non-game design specific writing. And then also step 4, which is gathering that feedback and working on refining your work. So start simple. You need to begin by establishing the core framework of your story, so the key characters and critical decisions. And one thing that a lot of people don't focus on as much as they should is that characters should actually be making decisions. You You need to let your characters develop naturally based on the dilemmas that your world produces. For example, what would happen if a character grew up in a lively backwater shantytown versus a sprawling suburban complex? What are all the different perspectives you can imagine spawning from those situations that you create? Maybe contractors are making a move to drain the swamps in order to create an urban jungle instead. Do characters oppose this, promote this? How do characters react to their environments, and what decisions do they make based on the perspectives that they're meant to represent? Because not all characters have to feel relatable or perfectly realistic, they just have to tell your story. Then we're going to be gradually adding complexity by iterating on dialogue interactions and branching choices, especially if you're writing a game. We don't want to overcomplicate things at the start. We want to let the story evolve naturally as we test and gather feedback, and let it evolve specifically from those world-building pillars that we're expected to establish as narrative designers. So an example of how we might go about doing iterations on like a line of dialogue. We could have our first version, which is, I heard that there's an evil hag that lives in the forest, which is, simple. And then what if we wanted to take it from an accusatory perspective? The forest, are you mad? There's a witch in those woods. And then the third perspective, a stuffy perspective, reports state that a practitioner of the dark arts has taken up residency within the forest. None of these examples are explicitly right or wrong, but there is one that you will be able to find that works best for your context. But sometimes the best thing isn't the first thing that we come up with, so try to find something that isn't your first choice. Next, we're going to be focusing on the key moments of our story. So when we're starting, we need to focus on the key decision points or critical emotional moments in the narrative, which are supposed to be your focal points for iteration. Once these key events are solid, you can flesh out the smaller moments and dialogue options that support them. So this is sort of the scenario where a lot of people find that note cards are useful. By taking all of these critical points and separating them from their traditional narrative order that we initially draft up, we can construct other alternative ways that a reader or player could reach these critical points and find the best possible order of plotting out those emotional beats. So we have an example exercise. If we take a classic example of Little Red Riding Hood and we break it into its core moments, we have Grandma being eaten, Little Red who travels, and the threat of the wolf. Right? So the idea is, how many other stories could you tell with this combination of core moments? You can tell a lot. And so then you're going to want to test all of those different versions that you come up with to figure out which version of the story best actually achieves the goals of the narrative that you're trying to tell. And usually doing like 3 to 5 is more than enough, just to get like your brain going and making sure that you're actually assessing all of your possible options. Then playtesting early and often, so once you've actually written a segment or a story path, we need to test it with others. So playtesting sort of gives you insight into how players or readers interact with the narrative and whether their choices actually feel meaningful. So we're going to want to encourage testers to make different choices to see how well the narrative holds up and whether it adapts in a way that it makes sense. So you're going to want to have people read it and critique it. And if something makes sense to you but doesn't to them, you can't immediately dismiss it. Because if players really don't seem engaged, we need to be asking them why and not discounting the feedback that we receive. Iterative writing is really nurtured by this frequent style of receiving feedback and treating ideas as precious, because they are precious while they're serving our story, but after that, they become either useless to us or they become something that we can use for later, but they don't serve this exact moment. And we need to understand that. So then step 4, getting that feedback organized and refining what you have. And this is also kind of where the cycle starts again. We can loop back to 1 after this. But after playtesting, we're going to need to gather feedback on the narrative and decide what worked, what didn't, and sort of use this feedback to refine specific moments of the story. So this could mean adjusting dialogue, altering a character's motivations, or even changing some outcome of a decision point. Because we can have an example like this where, in the context of writing game narrative, players don't feel like their choices actually matter, and so we have to figure out what is or what isn't working, because that's a massive problem. So we can take one of those key decision points in our story and then write 3 different outcomes for the decision, keeping in mind that, they should all have their immediate and long-term consequences. So we would playtest these choices by imagining how each choice would affect the overall story, or actually having it written in and prototyped. so that people can actually play it. We need to understand whether the consequences feel authentic and impactful, and then refine the writing to make sure that the outcomes are clear and engaging. So go through your choices and ask yourself if you feel like there are any false choices, or like two choices that could lead to the same result but appear different, and try to iterate on each one and make each option feel distinct and offer meaningful divergent outcomes. And this kind of exercise can also serve to improve non-game related writing because your characters are still making these choices. And so much of good narrative is based on the choices that they make in relation to their internal and external conflicts. So an exercise like this ensures that every choice a player or a character makes is authentic and impactful in relation to the story that you're trying to tell. And that's pretty much it. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of iterative writing as a framework that you can use to get started with your storytelling process. And remember that it focuses on agile techniques related to quick iterations, frequent testing of your work, and then problem solving to understand what works and what doesn't. Again, iterative writing is a repeated cycle, and you can continue iterating until you're satisfied with your work. And that's going to be all. Thank you.